Let's come to the 6th of Hermetic America presentations. And we're looking at the catalog of the printing of Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia. And you can see it's many, many hundreds of pages. What Hermetic America begins with is the printing career of Benjamin Franklin. Have her come in. Benjamin Franklin's immense printing career included every conceivable kind of printed object, from contracts to money to pamphlets, brochures, almanacs, books, and as a young man, all of it was set by hand. So that literally the ancient Paleolithic hand that was always the seal of a new refinement of humanity, instead of just being Homo sapiens, which our kind had been for 120,000 years by the time the first hand appeared in Paleolithic art, and that was 40-some thousand years ago. From the time that Homo sapiens first emerged in southern Africa, now 160,000 some years ago, the introduction of the hand as the primordial symbol of comprehension was the way in which a new refinement of our species was sealed. Homo sapiens sapiens. Man wise about being wise, having learned how to be wise over the long maturation of himself through infancy, through an extended childhood, into a youth. And that hand appeared again 300 years ago in the sense of Benjamin Franklin's printing, holding together the type, the words, the language, the printed symbols of a transform to a new kind of refinement to our species. The refinement 45,000 years ago, from Homo sapiens to Homo sapiens sapiens, began a new refinement about 300 years ago, so that we have been evolving towards Homo sapiens stellaris, star wisdom man. And one of the most primordial qualities of that hand is to have it opened to reveal the star within ourselves that is the spirit of our person. And the collection of those stars is the expanse of heaven itself. That quality was reflected in the making of a circle of stars for the first American flag. That circle of 13 stars is a primordial wisdom configuration going back to the age of the beginnings of the return to the Holy Land by the wandering Israelites coming back into the promised inheritance after the Exodus, after 40 years in the wilderness. And that circle at the time was not just simply stars, but the earth foundation of the heavens, the stones. And the figure who had survived the entire Exodus, there were only two who lived all the way through to the reentry to the Promised Land. One was named Caleb, and the other's name was Joshua. And Joshua was the leader, the great general. When they crossed the Jordan River to take possession again of the Promised Land, the land of milk and honey, Joshua had the Ark of the Covenant go before the people. And just as the Ark of the Covenant had parted the Red Sea to allow them to leave Egypt to go on the Exodus, so too the Jordan River was parted. It was stopped from flowing, and the people crossed the Jordan River, not fording it, but crossed on dry land. And to signify that the Ark of the Covenant had made this repeat to the Exodus from Egypt being culminated and sealed in the entry to the Promised Land, 12 stones were taken from the dry bed of the Jordan River and carried with them. And at a place just northeast of the ancient city of Jericho, on a mount, those 12 stones, presenting the spiritual miracle of the 12 tribes, were arranged in a circle. And that stone circle was the place where the Ark of the Covenant then was set, and the celebration with food of that event was the first Passover. It's the origin of Passover. It's the origin of Easter. It is one of the most primordial events in human history. Going forward 4,000 years, the circle of the 13 stars of the original American flag is again a new Passover. It is a new Easter. It is the arrival at a new configuration of the new Promised Land, that its promise was given in the Renaissance by the discovery of Christopher Columbus in 1492. And by the time the United States was formulated and held its first election, with George Washington being elected in 1788, that circle of stars, that ancient circle of stones, sealed by the hand, was held to be inheritable because of a deep reading of the New Testament. That the ancient Paleolithic existed was not known at that time. Not discovered until the late 19th century, and some of the places where the hand is most prominent were not discovered until early in the 20th century. The quality of the sealing of Benjamin Franklin's work came with the election in 1800 of Thomas Jefferson as the third president of the United States. It was a sealing event, and it was fortified by Jefferson of going back into the historical development to the pivotal function, the 2,000 years before Jesus, of the founding of the Hebrew lineage by Abraham, and we live at a time where it's 2,000 years after Jesus, who now then becomes a very pivotal figure. One of the qualities of Jefferson realizing, as we do now in 2008, that just to have a new vision is just the beginning of a great deal of hard work and effort that needs to be sealed. And that sealing, almost 208 years ago, by Jefferson, was to take a scissors to the New Testament and to cut out all of the language of Jesus and paste it together in what has been called Jefferson's Bible, the philosophy of Jesus and the life and morals of Jesus. And he then had printed enough copies of this Jefferson Bible to personally go and hand it to every member of Congress, all of those in the House of Representatives, all of those in the Senate. He personally distributed this. We've seen a replay of this direct approach just in the last couple of days of Barack Obama going to Washington, D.C., instead of continuing just to campaign, to go directly to the House of Representatives simply to present himself so that he can be seen without the welter of critics and criticisms and distortions over a long campaign season. And this goes back also to a figure who is the inheritor of the Jeffersonian elan, and that is Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln was elected, instead of going to Washington, D.C. directly, he went to New York City, and he walked down Broadway in full view of 100,000 collected together to jeer about this country bumpkin from the Midwest coming in to rule, to govern, to be the president. And the great account of it is Woodrow Wilson, who became a president himself. His father took the 9-year-old Woodrow Wilson, along with all the others, to jeer at Lincoln. But when he was seen in his bare person of enormous dignity and nobility, no one jeered. Wilson records that New York City was silent in the face of the man. We understand that the United States, at its foundation, with Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson especially, that their preference was to go directly to the sealing of the way in which life expands itself, not from the individual, but expands itself as resonances of a spiritual person. And that the sharing of spiritual persons is what a community of the promise, of the blessed, is able to confer. Jefferson had worked, by the time he was elected, for 32 years on building his home, Monticello, on a mountaintop just above the lower level where Charlottesville is. That home was an insight into a peculiar happening that developed within a year after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. It was a commemorative event. His crucifixion and resurrection happened on Passover of 36 AD. And on Passover 37 AD, a small group of those closest to Jesus arrived in the great metropolis of Ephesus, now in Turkey, at that time in the Roman province of Asia Minor, on the Aegean Sea, directly across from where the major cities like Athens would be. But if one went out into the bay from Ephesus, you could look to the north and see Chios, the ancient home of Homer, and turn and look the other way and see the island of Samos, the ancient island home of Pythagoras. And so Ephesus was in between Homer and Pythagoras, was at the cutting edge of a great city at the time, and the little band that moved there was Jesus' closest companion, Mary Magdalene, and his mother, Mary, who was at the time 63 years old. She lived another 12 years. She lived until 48 AD, and she passed on. The saying was she fell asleep at the age of 75. Also with them was the young St. John, for John had been given to Mary Magdalene as her adopted son. The distortion in doctrinaire biblical promulgations is that his mother was made the mother of St. John, which is ridiculous because she was already his grandmother. John's mother was one of 4 sisters of Jesus, Salome, who married Zebedee. And John and his brother James were nephews of Jesus, but they were grandsons of Mary the mother. You don't give your grandsons to their grandmother to be their mother. He was entrusted to Mary Magdalene as his mother, but a spiritual mother. The only child that Jesus had in that scenario is the adoption of John, who was 12 years old at the time. And for a 12-year-old Hebrew, it is important to undergo a year's instruction to when you are 13, to when you have your bar mitzvah. And a mitzvah is a sealing of the maturity of something witnessed by God. And that as long as one keeps the seal, the witness is eternal, and there is no way for anyone to undo that in terms of the world or man. It becomes an eternal reality. There is not only a bar mitzvah for the boys, but a bar mitzvah for girls is possible as well. When they arrived, there were 2 other young men, 2 of the younger brothers. Jesus had 4 sisters and 4 brothers. 2 of the younger brothers, Joseph and Shimon, were carpenters because their father, Joseph, was not only a carpenter, he didn't just make wooden things. He grew trees. He knew how to build everything, up to and including houses. And so the 2 youngest sons of Joseph, along with the young John, and 2 of the apostles, Philip and Nathanael, better known as Bartholomew, built a house for Mary Magdalene so that she could take care of the aged mother of Jesus and raise the young John, who became St. John. This is a photograph of the restoration of that house. It is called the House of the Nightingales, and in Greek, the House of the Nightingales is Ekaria Nyktopoulia. the house of the night birds. This house had a very particular area on the side, which was hollowed out on the inside to form a little alcove. And it was in this alcove, called in Greek a monasterion, that one did one's praying, one did one's meditating, one did one's visioning to keep purifying, to purify out of the sense of an isolated individual into the permeation of being in the larger visionary concourse that is the promise of a heavenly home. It is this quality in this house of the nightingales on a hill about 30 minutes walk from the major sections of Ephesus. Ephesus is like Pompeii in Italy. Enough ruins have survived because the city was never destroyed. It was let fall to ruin because the harbor that had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years silted up, and the coast was many miles away. And so Ephesus classically was finally, ultimately just abandoned. And one can go to Ephesus today. This is the Insight Guide to Turkey. And one can find enough ruins, as the Turks say, there are more Greek ruins in Turkey than there are in Greece. One can walk down the Great Marble Way, which is intact for miles, and notice major structures that were never ruined, they were never sacked, they were never burnt. They just fell into decay over the long millennium and a half or so since it was there. In the guide, one finds this statement. According to one tradition, the Virgin Mary came to Ephesus with St. John and lived here from 37 AD until her death in AD 48. Her house, the Mariae Mana, is open from dawn to dusk. Its entrance is, there is a fee. It's worth a visit, if only for the refreshing woody paths and mountain streams. It has been converted to a chapel and a popular place of pilgrimage for both Christians and Muslims who venerate Mary as a saint. The icons are reputed to have curative powers attested to by the crutches and braces left by healed pilgrims. There is also there, in the trees surrounding this home, thousands and thousands of bits of cloth that have been tied in those trees in thanks for the healing, for the blessing. This is a deeply resonant quality with Tibetan prayer flags, because the Tibetan prayer flags are related exactly to this kind of a tradition. One of the qualities in Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, which he began planning in 1768. He was just in his mid-20s. He worked on it and recast it all through his long life. And a deep resonance that we talked about last week is that for his home, which was more like a villa than just a house, it was an expansion of the house into a villa in the Renaissance style, and then transformed into an American Renaissance villa, hearkening all the way back to the fulcrum of the original quality of the presentational eternity of Jesus. And when one takes a look at Jefferson's Bible, Jefferson's extracts from the gospel, and we'll do that in greater detail next week, One of the qualities that comes out of this is that the more that we look at the architecture of Thomas Jefferson, we look back through him to the architecture in the Renaissance. And that architecture in the Renaissance indeed is a prism looking back some 1,500 years to the classical architecture that was there in the time of Jesus. And the classical architecture there, though it had Roman developments, its basic structure, its harmonic form was classical Greek going back to Pythagoras. So that if one comes to certain studies, this one published in 1976 by Cornell University Press, Pythagorean palaces, the Pythagorean geometry behind Renaissance architecture. The Renaissance architecture, based on Pythagoras, is a development of 500 years of sophistication from Pythagoras to the time of Jesus. And within 2 generations after the death and crucifixion, the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, in that 2 generations, St. John matured and became one of the last living figures to have seen Jesus with his own eyes. St. John lived to be in his late 70s, and he went to sleep about 102 AD in the reign of Trajan. The famous saying in the Gospel of John towards the end, Peter, who is following Jesus, says, well, what about this man, meaning this boy, this 12-year-old John? And Jesus said, it is no concern of yours that he tarry until I come. And John then writes, he did not say to Peter, this man will not die, but that it is no business of yours if he tarries until I come, because he will be the last personal witness. Mary Magdalene went to sleep in 56 AD. And her physical body was buried within walking distance of Ephesus and its center and the House of the Nightingales on a hill just a couple of miles to the northeast. She was buried in the Cave of the Seven Sleepers. And the Cave of the Seven Sleepers is the only place mentioned in the Quran and in Christian traditions with the same veneration. I will bring again next week a photograph of her great sarcophagus in the Cave of the Seven Sleepers. The cave is not just a little cave, but it's very much like the interior of a Renaissance cathedral. It has all of the great Hellenistic qualities of an enormous cathedral, and the sarcophagus of Mary Magdalene is large enough to have contained 2 bodies, that of Mary Magdalene and that of Mary the Mother as well, so that the archetypal sense for someone who is not really refined to the point to be able to understand and appreciate those kinds of differences, they are confused. So that the house today on guides is called the House of the Virgin Mary, when she was being taken care of in the house of Mary Magdalene. St. John was raised there. The great Basilica of St. John was within walking distance, also down in the center of Ephesus, and at the time was the largest church, the largest cathedral in Christendom. What happens with Thomas Jefferson? Having inherited and been tutored by a population of people who had been tutored by Benjamin Franklin during a long life. He lived to be 84. From 1706 to 1790, he lived to see the United States emerge, to see the 13 stars in its circle. But one of the things that we have been talking about is that Benjamin Franklin seeded and founded a great many functions that were original to him, original to the United States and original to the world. He founded the first public library in the world. But he also founded a special place where people of all faiths could come and give their sermons. And that academy in downtown old Philadelphia became the site, after it expanded, of the University of Pennsylvania. And the University of Pennsylvania has a seal. And on the seal of the University of Pennsylvania, this is the seal here, and this is a wax impression having the seal put on it. One notices at the top of the seal a star, and the star has radiant beams coming out from all over. Below that star is what is called an orrery. It's a French word. It means a mechanical arrangement of the sun and the moon and the moving planets, so that one can see the movement of the whole star system in one symbol. This orrery, there were 2 copies made, one for the College of Philadelphia that became the University of Pennsylvania, the other made for the College of Princetown, which became Princeton. The maker of these 2 orreries was David Rittenhouse. Benjamin Franklin was the first president of the American Philosophical Society. Thomas Jefferson was the 3rd president of the American Philosophical Society, and David Rittenhouse was the 2nd, in between them. And the American Philosophic Society's transactions are still being printed today, several hundreds of years later. When I was researching Franklin and Thoreau for a year at the Huntington, I found myself one time down in the back rooms of the basement, and there was a locked wire cage. And getting that unlocked and opened, I went in, and one entire wall of this vault were all the publications of the transactions of the American Philosophical Society, thousands and thousands of them. The studies spanned the entire world of science, of art, of history, of the whole ecology of the conscious vision. This was the American expansion of the Royal Society in England, founded in 1666. At that time, it was not apparent that there was going to be a new world separate from the old world. The new world had been heavily colonized by empire like France, like England, like Spain. And it was the empire colonies that seemed to have their foothold on the New World. What we're looking at is the transition in a quality of man that was able to step away from the old world and seal itself in a new world that had been visioned in the Renaissance but had never been accomplished. And what is important about Hermetic America is to try to understand certain ways in which that seal was made. From David Rittenhouse's orrery of being able to see into the workings of the whole star system came an American emphasis on astronomy that was practical. The largest telescope in the world at the time of Franklin Jefferson was William Herschel's 40-inch telescope in England. We will see with Hermetic America that when the vision refined itself late in the 19th century, American astronomy stepped into a complete new world of possibility. And the first great figure in that, as we will see, is George Ellery Hale, who started with a little homemade telescope in his backyard. And on the other side of his backyard, from his parents' house, was the University of Chicago. George Ellery Hale grew up to be not only a professor of astronomy, but the founder of astrophysics. He made his own instruments like Franklin, like Rittenhouse, like Thomas Jefferson. And he became so good at it and convincing other people that they could make better and better, larger, more comprehensive instruments, that he finally had a very large observatory built. At the time, Chicago had not dark enough skies, so it was built in southern Wisconsin on the shores of Lake Geneva, Yerkes Observatory, which had a huge 60-inch telescope. And then Hale decided that we had to have an even larger telescope to compete with some of the large telescopes that were starting to be built. So he built the telescope observatory of Mount Wilson, just above Pasadena, for the 100-inch telescope. And then to make sure that the resonance spread out towards the end of his life, he designed and had built the 200-inch telescope at Mount Palomar, which when it opened in 1948 was one of the wonders of the New World. I'll bring a photograph of several hundreds of people seated in chairs to hear the announcement of the unveiling in 1948, the opening of it, the first light. And the telescope at Palomar was so large that it at first is not even visible as an instrument, but it is like a man-made technological statue of enormous dimensions above them. We now had the setting where two of the successors that came in under George Ellery Hale in his life, Edwin Hubble and Harlow Shapley, took that into even larger resonances, and it is the discovery of galaxies and the expanding universe by Edwin Hubble, using the astrophysics of George Ellery Hale, that has led to the great revolution in astronomy in our time. Harlow Shapley, not only a great astronomer, but a great Hermetic American, as we will see almost all of them are, of being involved in the politics of the day, the politics of FDR's age, the New Deal. He had a daughter born in 1914 named Mildred. When she grew up, she married a man named Matthews. Today, in her 90s, Mildred Shapley Matthews is still a distinguished author and publisher of the great series of books on our astronomy published by the University of Arizona Press. I'll bring in a couple of her books next week so you can see they're more than 1,000 pages each. All of this begins with Benjamin Franklin tutoring a couple of generations that by the time Rittenhouse and Jefferson came along, they had the traction and they had the dynamic so that they could open it up. Franklin paid attention to western Pennsylvania as if it were one of the largest extensions that one could practically do, and he dreamed of extending the United States to the Mississippi River. Within one generation after that, Jefferson extended the United States to the Pacific Ocean. We have extended the reach of the United States in its visionary Hermetic form so that we now have a New Horizons robot spaceship heading out towards Pluto and Charon, and will rendezvous with that farthest reach in 2015. So that we have become a star system humanity largely because of not only the way that Hermetic Americans have been able to vision harmonics, but to absorb what we will call honorary Hermetic Americans. This country has always been a nation of immigrants. And one of the great explosions came in the 1930s and 1940s when the cream of Europe and Asia and many other places came to the United States. And the most distinguished of them was Albert Einstein, who was very glad to take out American citizenship because he had lost his citizenship in Europe and was stateless for many, many years. And when he came here, he took his citizenship out in 1940, exactly at the time when I was born. Let's take a little break. Let's come back to Hermetic America. We are looking with a new visionary field, and we are looking at the complexity of the development of civilization that led up to the United States and has led up to this present threshold of great change in the United States as a prism of the entire planet. Almost every possible nationality and creed are represented not only in the United States, but in a planetary city like Los Angeles. In the greater metropolitan area of Los Angeles, there are 240 different languages spoken. In the Los Angeles of its Indian past, the Los Angeles Basin had linguistically more linguistic diversity than all of Europe. There were more than 20 different American Indian language families spoken in the Los Angeles Basin area. It is a very special place. And in the Second World War, you had some of the most interesting transformational geniuses of Europe come to a place like Los Angeles and find not only a refuge, but a place in which they could develop their work in new ways from the genius of their European excellence to a new level of genius. One of the figures was Thomas Mann, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature for The Magic Mountain in 1927. When he came to Los Angeles and lived off Chautauqua Boulevard out by Santa Monica and the Palisades region, he wrote his Dr. Faustus novel here, which features a protagonist who is a musical composer who faces a demonic possibility of transformation and yearns to try to find some way not to suffer damnation by sampling some of it. A second figure, and I'll just mention those two for today, was Arnold Schoenberg, one of the greatest composers in 20th century music, and who left all of his works and writings to the Schoenberg Center of the University of Southern California, which it was not well cared for and now is being relocated to Europe. But it was here in Los Angeles that Schoenberg developed not just his composing, but the refinement of his musical theory of harmony and harmonics. And the University of California Press still publishes his great theory of music. One of the Hermetic American theses of Schoenberg is that there is no such thing as dissonance. That dissonance is simply a larger harmonic than we previously were able to hear. This goes back to the way in which, before there was a Christianity with its hierarchy of authority, with its structure of the church, that Jesus was understood in a more primordial way as the presenter of a visionary field that was capable of having an opening of openings. And that this opening of openings was such a way that when it was used as the seal for transformations, those transformations were no longer limited to the world. They were no longer limited to all the onenesses of the world, of existence, the unities and integrals of the understandings of the mind, but that this transformation of transformations was open to the openness of the cosmos as well, the spaces in between the ones. That the ones indeed are quanta, but they are ones because they are distinct from each other and they are articulated, they are separated. Their ones are ones, but the context which is in between them and behind them and around them and even through them is a quality of zero, of openness itself. And so the ancient seal, before there was a church concerned with the existentials and the mentals, there was a great way which was concerned with being able to live by and to learn thereby the balance of the openness of the divine mystery and the actualness of the world's occurrence existentially and symbolically integral. And so the seal was not a seal of just a hand, but was a seal of two hands brought together. That the ancient prayer orans was now brought together in what becomes not only a prayer in the West, but becomes the Gasho in the East, becomes the Namaste in India. And so the entire world has this quality. And one finds the ancient Paleolithic still here in America up until about 100 years ago, because the primordial American Indians would greet each other with the hand. H-A-U, how? Or Yatehe, the welcoming that we go together on the same great red road. And by going together, by hunting together, by living together, there come events and thresholds and times where we can be brought together in a more sustaining way, if only the seal can be done in such a way that it is shareable throughout the entire community. In Pennsylvania, the first diplomatic symbol given to any European was a wampum belt given to William Penn that allowed him to travel through any tribal areas. At the time, originally there were 5 great civilized tribes and later the 6 tribes of the Iroquois League. And William Penn's wampum belt, draped over the arm like a maitre d', ready to seat you at the feast, allowed him to enter any tribal encampment and to have the right to speak as an elder in that tribal encampment at that meeting. And so American Indian oratory had at its pinnacle a quality of intertribal sealing of not just a wampum belt, which was money rearranged so that it was now a currency of freedom. Not to spend it to buy something, but to use it to create a larger community. This quality of William Penn and his wampum belt was guaranteed because each tribe had a wise man, a sachem, who was the pivot for that tribe in his life of being able to guarantee that one could hear the truth in a correct oratory, and that the hearing of the truth, not only that you had ears to hear, but you had a conscious field of visioning that was able to understand what transforms were needed for whatever crisis or threat was there before us. We live at a time where there is a triple crisis compounded by a 4th crisis. The first crisis concerns the planet. Not only the health of the planet, but that the health of the planet is integrally braided together with a planetary culture. Not a single culture, but a planetary culture that has a kaleidoscope of facets to it, but is shared in common throughout the entire population of mankind. And so it is the crisis of a planetary culture, of not just 5 or 6 tribes, not just 240 different languages, but all groups, everywhere on the planet, not knit together in an empire, but held together in a community that is sealed by planetary shepherds, by planetary sachems, who have come very close now to finding a way to have a planetary wampum belt. The current head of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, is a Korean. And before him, Kofi Annan was an African. And there is absolutely no problem that a Korean and an African succeed the first general director, Jacob Lee, and Dag Hammarskjöld, and figures like that. So the first crisis is the planetary, being brought together in such a way that it's not mashed into an empire. It's not condensed into an authority, but is held in its articulation, so that what is prized is all the different cultures and the shared common denominator of the planetary culture itself. The second crisis is one of civilization. Civilizations have lifetimes. They occur as time forms. And when their time form is finished, when it has run out, there needs to be, at those times, a new civilization that is developed, not made, but created out of the field of nature, out of the field of vision together in a complexity. And our new civilization needs to be star system wide so that we are able to be viable on the interstellar frontier. The first crisis is one of a planetary culture, the second of a stellar civilization, and the third of a refinement of our species. To understand that we are not only all together on a planet and capable of inhabiting quite technically and consciously the entire star system, but that we share an interstellar frontier with many other stellar civilizations. The stars are not simply there in a pattern of a circle. The signs of the zodiac, the 12 signs, are only 12 signs of a thin diameter of 88 constellations around the planet. And if you go off the planet, the constellations will begin to subtly shift. And if you go into interstellar space, they will change radically. If you go a couple of hundred light years out, you will not see the constellation of Orion. The only 5 stars that will hold together are the 3 stars of the belt, and Rigel and Betelgeuse. You will get a different kind of a shape. So to limit ourselves to some kind of an occult limitation of a sliver of continuity in a civilization that has already run its course. The new civilization needs to be one where we are alert and conscious and able to function on the interstellar frontier. That requires a refinement of our species from Homo sapiens sapiens to Homo sapiens stellaris. It is the Hermetic American inheritance of the last 300 years that gives us the best field of realization from which to work towards this, from which to develop it. One of the most primordial things before there was a Christianity in a church was that Jesus was talked about as the teacher of the way. Not simply the teacher of the way, but the sealer of the reality of the openness, being able to articulate the existential so that it is quite distinctly existential, and really is, and also to articulate the spaces in the structure of the mind so that symbolic systems are not bricked shut. It's not a closed mind, but an open mind. And we will see when we get to the late 1930s, 2 of the most powerful figures in the world, understanding the one, maybe one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, Hermann Weyl, and the other, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, Niels Bohr, both wrote books about the open mind to the population of the planet, stressing that only an open mind is able to envision an open world. And it's only an open world that can live together in a kaleidoscopic way so that the different facets are the facets of like a jewel. That the number of facets is only testimony and testament to the fantastic radiance and scintillation of our kind. Homo sapiens sapiens could only appeal to a very rarefied view. The Homo sapiens stellaris is a seeding of a new kind of learning so that everyone participates in this. We've seen how Benjamin Franklin laid the seeds and nourished them so that the University of Pennsylvania came into being, of how Jefferson laid the seeds and nourished the University of Virginia to come into being. And we will see that all of this then accelerated so that in the 19th century, you had not only dozens and scores, but you had hundreds of universities that were suddenly sprouting everywhere. Not only a public library, the first in the world in Philadelphia, but a whole skein of public libraries spanning the entire continent, and all of these enthusing the rest of the world so that they joined in and followed suit. The medieval University of Oxford or the University of Paris was deeply transformed by Franklin and by Jefferson. And that whole educational transform, as we will see, gains ground especially, will take some great exemplars in the 19th century. The Concord School of Philosophy, which was nourished by Emerson and Thoreau and Margaret Fuller and Bronson Alcott, became one of the shining lenses of the possibilities of education. And in the 1880s, on the death of Emerson, it was already apparent that a whole new quality of Hermetic America education was developing. One of the great lecturers at the Concord School of Philosophy at that time was William James. A contemporary of William James was John Dewey. And we will see that Dewey's contribution to education, not only educational theory, but educational actuality, had as much influence as anyone has had since the Renaissance. And there are books like this, The Living Thoughts of Thomas Jefferson, presented by John Dewey. And we will see, to greet the year 1900, John and his wife Evelyn wrote a book called Schools of Tomorrow. And the influence of this quality of Hermetic America understanding led Dewey more and more into understanding how experience is transformed into art. And one of his great accomplishments was to take his Vermont-born Yankee Hermetic American practicality on a guest lectureship to China. And when he got to China, he was deeply impressed by the Chinese beginning Renaissance at the time. And John Dewey was the most read thinker in China up until World War II, when Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong made an attempt to come to speak to FDR in Washington, respecting that America was the real beacon for them. They were refused entrance. and turned instead then to Marxist-Leninism. One of the severest critics at the time that happened was a professor who was up in Berkeley, and we used to consult him, and I will bring in some of his books. And the whole event ballooned around a continuing tragedy that the would-be projection of American power on scale of an empire became a topic that was illuminable in the Second World War. And I will bring 2 volumes of what is called the Amerasia Papers, published by the U.S. government printing office in a very rare set. It almost immediately was withdrawn, went out of print, as they say, and copies in major university libraries were not retrievable. They were mislaid. They were checked out. There were any number of excuses. But I will bring a set that I was able to, in my work 40 years ago, to lay hold of. One of the qualities that Dewey was able to bring into play is that the logic of empire is based on the authority of the power of identification of existential things and their actions and mental arrangements of those actions and things into doctrines and plans. Dewey wrote a seminal book. Its title is Logic, a Theory of Inquiry. That logic is about the ability to inquire into the unknown. And one can make movement, have a dynamic into the unknown, only if you have the articulation of what is and the transformation of what it could be. The most succinct phrasing of this was done 40 years ago in the early summer of 1968. Robert F. Kennedy, who said, "Some men look at the world and see it in all of its difficulties and ask why. I look at the world with all of its possibilities of transformation and ask why not." We're coming up to the 40th anniversary of the assassination of that man, who not only won the California primary, was going to get the nomination to go to Chicago and to become president. We live in a time where the interruption of certain developments reappears almost by magic, as they used to say, but it's by a hermetic quality. One of the qualities of Jesus' great way, and he used to call it the Great Way, in India, when it transformed Buddhism, it was called the Mahayana. And the meeting of Christianity's primordiality great way and the Indian development from St. Thomas into the beginnings of the Mahayana with Ashvaghosha and Nagarjuna. The figure in between Thomas and Ashvaghosha was, his name was Parshva. The Mahayana grew in the south of India where Thomas was and spread up through India along the Godavari River into central India. And there is a great resonance between the Greek Indian kingdoms of about 150, 200 BC with the Alexandrian Jewish communities of the same period, 150 to 200 BC. The great figure in India, Ashoka, the emperor for 50 years of the Ashokan Empire, the Mauryan dynasty inheritor, sent envoys consistently to Alexandria from its founding. And so for more than 300 and some years, Alexandria and centers in India, especially in South India, had a shared Hellenistic quality. And one of the sharings was that because of the distances and the complications in cultures, in languages, in styles of civilization, they needed a population of people who were good at international affairs. Alexander the Great chose to have a great Hebrew presence in Alexandria because they were the most experienced. They had more than 2,000 years of international caravan trading experience from the time of Sargon the Great, 2350 BC, to Alexander's time some 2,000 years later. And so in Alexandria, the Hebrew community was a very large, honored part of the population, especially concerned with international affairs and events, and not only trade, but languages, of meetings of many different kinds of minds on a common denominator basis, and not just making money and doing business, but having trade, and the trade also in ideas, the trade in making a tapestry of possibilities. And so Hellenistic Judaism became the shining exemplar of a new quality of civilization about 200 to 150 BC. We're going to talk next week more about the development of architecture, because it's in the architecture of the home especially that one finds a genius in the Hermetic America experience that became truly transformative in the world. When we look at the plans of Monticello, or we look at a photograph of Monticello, one of the outstanding effects of this is the crown of the house. The crown of the house is this dome on the third level of Monticello. This third level dome sets a particular tone. It goes back to the Renaissance. It goes back to the great architect Palladio. He lived in the 1500s. And one of his great houses is called La Rotonda in the Venice area of Renaissance Italy. The most human thing about La Rotonda is its stance. It is poised above the slope like a human being, fronting the void. It rests on the earth in the gentlest possible way, as if just starting up from it. It is foursquare and strong, but devoid of aggression. And it stands in nature probably more like a Greek temple, or more calmly and bravely than any other building since antiquity has done. It is the best of mankind, the noblest, not destroying the natural world, but completing it. And we will see that Palladio based himself on the first of the great Renaissance architectural theorists, Leon Battista Alberti. We always think of Brunelleschi and his great dome of the Duomo in Florence Cathedral, or Michelangelo making the great dome of the new St. Peter's, or Bramante doing his architecture, but it is Alberti who is the first of the great Renaissance architects, and his 10 books of architecture are a recasting of the 10 books of architecture by the great Roman architect Vitruvius. From Vitruvius to Alberti, you have a resonance of the way in which there are not just rules of building, but there are principles of good building that are based on mathematical geometry that holds across the universe, holds for all time. And that it is not only in architecture. Alberti's most famous little book is called On Painting. He wrote it in, it's called De Pictura in Latin, in 1435. He unfolds his theory step by step. In book 1, he explains the process of vision. In book 2, he sets out to instruct the painter on how he can present with his hand what he understood with his mind. Book 3 stipulates the moral and artistic prerequisites of the painter. So that what I am presenting to you is in a direct harmonic back through these prisms, these prismatic persons, these jewel stages of events of the real unfolding deeper than an evolution. It is an opening out of resonance into harmonics. We're looking at the way in which one of the cores of this was that the Hermetic way predates and precedes the formal church. That before there was a church structure, there was a teacher named Jesus. And all the way back 1,800 years later, someone like a Thomas Jefferson is able to understand that we must hear the man. If we hear the man, we have prepared ourselves in such a way that we not only hear, but we are able to converse back. And so a great dialogue is set up between man and his furthest opening. And in this way, he learns that the language is not one of conflict, but of an invitation to learn. And if we have an acceptance together where we learn together, we have a wonderful phrase. A great, interesting woman named Ruth Montgomery said, companions along the way. It comes evidently originally from Socrates, who many times in Plato's dialogues says we cannot learn anything until we are companions together. And when we have that companionability, it is not only contagious, but the resonance is extendable beyond the planet, beyond the star system, into the very vaults of heavens itself. And that the reality of this is made as a promise. It will be real when you do it. More next week.